Thank you, Chair Lady, for the nice introduction. Well, actually, before I get started, I have to confess something to you. I was not supposed to speak at the session. I was served as the chair, of course. But one of the speakers pre-chosen was not able to come to this conference. So, one stone, two birds. So I was asked to speak at the session. So, well, the reason why I'm saying this to you before I get started is that I'm not a vice staff by training by any means. So the things that I'm going to go over during the next 20 or so minutes, it's not something that I'm experienced with, but I know how important it is, and then I sort of studied in what basis we can apply this kind of concept to actual clinical trial designs, particularly from the perspective of rating agencies, right at ones in South Korea. So, without further ado, oh, okay. What kind of music did you? Okay, there was a study named Jupiter. Jupiter is a big planet right next to Saturn. This is the acronym or the abbreviation, if you will, of the justification for the use of statins in prevention and intervention trial, evaluating rosuvastatin. Well, actually, I chose to study because Hyunjong came from AstraZeneca, and rosuvastatin is her drug. I was just kidding. No. This study was. Thank you. The study is was very unique in that it did not. Well, actually, if you look at the inclusion criteria, they were not hypercholesterolemic by any means. Now, the LDL cholesterol level was normal, but they were highly inflammatory prone. In other words, their level of high sensitivity CLP or C-reactive protein was higher than normal. So they just wanted to look at the efficacy of rosuvastatin in comparison with placebo in terms of preventing coronary heart disease and other comorbidities. And it planned until a total of 520 primary endpoints were observed. And before the study was embarked on, the study committee specified 2 interim looks. And the first interim look, the efficacy of rosuvastatin in terms of preventing coronary heart disease and other morbidities, mortality, was apparent. As you can see on this slide here, the reduction of the hazard ratio was approximately greater than 40%. So the independent data monitoring committee recommended to stop this study, but the study team continued to study 6 months more. But in total, the study was stopped. Was successfully completed 1.5 years earlier. So it was a success. So why are we talking about adaptive design clinical trials? Because we adapt because we live in a world full of uncertainty. Do you agree? So we have to adapt ourselves on a daily basis. Why not clinical trials? Adaptive design has some expectations. In other words, it may speed up drug development, which takes a lot of time. And also, there are several ethical advantages that you can think of. In other words, fewer subjects are exposed to unsafe or ineffective products. Because, as I showed in the first example that I showed to you, rosuvastatin study Jupiter, and also all the availability of effective products can be a possibility if adaptive design study is successfully completed. So I'll give you a brief history of adaptive design clinical trials. It was more than 10 years ago when pharma formed the adaptive design working group. They published, based on a series of seminars and symposiums, a white paper, which is followed by European agencies, the first ever regulatory guidance on adaptive clinical trial design in 2006. And it was followed by the FDA's critical path opportunities list, where clearly adaptive trial design is a future possibility. And it took additional 4 more years until the FDA finally drafted the first guidance, adaptive clinical trials. Okay, according to the FDA guidance, let me read this, the definition of adaptive design clinical study for you. Adaptive design clinical study is a study that includes a prospectively planned opportunity for modifications of one or more specified aspects of the study design and hypotheses based on analysis of data, usually interim data, from subjects in the study. Very clear. There are several keywords that I want to emphasize out of this definition. Number 1, prospectively planned. In other words, detailed protocol and a separate statistical analysis plan have to be prepared prior to the start of the study. But other studies, other clinical trials also have this kind of thing up front. But when it comes to clinical study based on or using adaptive design, has to have more in those. There are something that are not necessarily adaptive designs. For example, modifications or analysis which are not pre-specified. For example, unplanned changes in the eligibility criteria. We're doing those kind of things on a daily basis, but they are not necessarily adaptive design clinical trials. Retrospective or added changes after outcomes are known, this is not adaptive. In other words, adaptive design is not a replacement of poor planning. The second thing is modification. That's very important. But then I mean, pretty much everything in the study in terms of design can be adapted. And those things can be summarized by 4 or 5 different categories. Allocation rule, sampling rule, stopping and continuing rule, decision rule. And I think the next 2 speakers will give you more details about this concept. So let me give you another example. In other words, you can start with 3 different doses, and then you pre-specify the time at which you will look entering data. Also, you have to come up with the criteria by which you will continue or stop the trial. Okay? So you have 3 different doses to study. We're starting, and at the first time you look at the data, and there are 3 different doses. And the second time you look, and it's quite clear that the lowest dose might not be effective. Okay? Then you continue. Okay, that dose crossed the line, so we drop the dose, and then we continue to study using only those 2 doses. Okay? And I think I can skip this thing because the next speakers will address this better than I do. So I can skip this. The third thing that I want to emphasize out of the definition of the adaptive design clinical trials is that has to be based on data from the subjects enrolled in the specific study. Okay? So, for example, modifications have to be made entirely based on external information. We don't call that adaptive design clinical trial. But, well, life's not something that we can plan or anticipate 100%. So you might run into some cases where you have to adapt design of the study based entirely on external data. And then in that case, you have to come up with a series of strong rationale by which why you believe that is necessary. Okay, FDA's focus on adaptive designs are pretty much adequate and well controlled. This is a regulatory term, so this is basically interchangeable with confirmatory studies or phase 3 type of studies. The FDA guidance also encourages the employment of adaptive design only clinical drug development. They have been relatively silent on that. Okay, FDA came up with very interesting but troubling taxonomy, in other words, the way of classifying things in their guidance. Well understood and less well understood. But you know what? Well understood is very relative. It is a kind of relative time. In other words, at the point of the guidance, draft guidance, FDA simply said that we are not quite experienced or we're not quite understanding what this or that can do in terms of adaptive design. That's how FDA defined well understood or less well understood. So this slide shows the examples of well understood AD or adaptive design. Basically, almost every well understood adaptive design clinical trial has to be based on blinded to treatment effect. But there's one exception, group sequential design, which is something that many in this room are quite familiar with. In that study design, adaptation can take place unblinded result with regard to treatment effect. Last one understood, the single most important concept is that this is based on unblinded interim analysis. But as I mentioned before, group sequential design is a well-understood AD. Okay, so FDA's stance on adaptive design is that, yes, FDA is very encouraging they encourage us to use adaptive design, but at the same time, they try to keep some distance from adaptive design, or they are kind of cautious. Why? FDA has at least two different significant concerns. Number one, inflation of type 1 error. Type 1 error means being false positive. In other words, in fact, the drug is not effective, but for some reason, by chance, the study shows that the drug is effective. That's false positive or type 1 error. So basically, consumer risk. In other words, consumer like you and me will be exposed to this kind of risk if the drug is approved pretty much based on type 1 error inflated study results. Okay? In other words, because adaptive design is primarily based on more than one loop, one interim loop. If you look more, if you have more chance to look at interim data, then that you will have more chance to see that the study drug turns out to be efficacious, whereas in fact it is not, simply by chance. Okay, the second thing is that, and also one of the speakers, next two speakers will address on this issue, operational bias. In other words, in adaptive design clinical trials, it's very important you guys have to predetermine who will know what data, by when, and how. Because knowing the result will eventually, one way or another, the way that you conduct your study. So information leak is something that FDA sees very, very important, serious. So you guys have to come up with a charter or a series of SOPs, particularly in terms of the way that the independent data monitoring committee will look at the data. Okay, industry response. Yeah, they were very much happy with the guidance, but they were kind of, they changed, the industry had changed their stance because of the sort of the misunderstanding about the definition of less well understood, and it's simply the industry, pharmaceutical industry took this as something that means less understood is less encouraging, but that's not the case. Okay? And also, less emphasis on the exploratory studies in the guidance document has prevented the industry from using this design more often than actively. And also, the guidance did not say anything about when FDA can be consulted with regard to adaptive design clinical trials. Okay, so FDA reviewers recently published their experience with the adaptive design. This paper was particularly from the CBER, Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research. And according to this paper, as you can see in this graph, there is no trend at all. Well, when the guidance was promulgated or introduced, there's some hiccup, but not quite. So basically, this shows the sort of loose, the lukewarm, not hot, not cold, the response from the industry about the adaptive design clinical trials. And as you can imagine, the biggest adaptive design came from group sequential design, as you can see in this graph. So there are several issues with adaptive design, and I think the next two speakers will give you more details about these issues. But in contrast to the original expectation and enthusiasm about adaptive design clinical trials, adaptive design is not necessarily more powerful. In some cases, it can increase false negative industry risk. And also, it may not allow thoughtful exploration because of speed up, so you don't have time enough to look at what dose will work in the big phase 3 trial. So eventually, it may not save time. And also, in some cases, adaptive design cannot be applied. For example, if you involve all of the study subjects already, there is no time to adapt. In other words, randomization, adaptive randomization, and that kind of study. And also, if you have more than one endpoints by which your adaptation will take place, it's going to be very, very operationally complex, not to mention scientific complication. And for safety concern, it's not recommended to adapt yourself solely on the effectiveness, efficacy. So, this is my last slide. Yes, adaptive design can shed some light, very positive light, into the future of the design new clinical trials. But before you go into the route, you have to think about several things. Why do you use an adaptive design instead of the conventional fixed design? And then you have to be very, very specific about what kind of things you will adapt. And that has to be pretty specified, very, very details in both the study protocol and charter or SOPs. And also, all the time you have to think about how to control type 1 error and, of course, positive rate. And FDA recommends whenever you submit an AD-based study clinical trial, then you have to also submit the results of series of simulation experiments so that FDA can understand what kind of benefits will be possible out of the adaptive design trials. And also, you have to think about how to minimize, how to reduce the chance to leak out the information, which might affect the way that investigators are performing their studies. And the next two speakers will address more on that in more details. And also, the study stopping criteria, continuation criteria have to be very much specified in before you actually embark on an adaptive design trial. With that, I want to conclude my presentation, and I'm more than happy to answer your questions, but as Hyejong alluded to you, I'll answer toward the end of the session. So with that, I want to thank you for your attention. Thank you.